Good evening and welcome back. Settle in. Lower the lights if you'd like. There is nothing here you need to do tonight. Only listen and let the world grow quiet around you. Tonight we begin a new journey, north this time, into the cold seas and long winters of the Viking Age. Over these evenings we will follow the dragon ships wherever they went, to the monasteries of England and the rivers of Russia, across the open Atlantic to lands no European had ever seen, and down at last to a single arrow on a September afternoon that ended the whole age. But every age has a first morning. This one begins on a small tidal island off the coast of Northumbria in the early summer of the year 793. A holy island, home to gospel books and saints' bones, and a community of monks whose worst enemy until that morning was the weather. It begins with sails on the horizon, and it begins for everyone watching from the shore, far too late to do anything about it. This is the story of Lindisfarne and of the first fury of the Northmen. To understand what was lost that morning, you have to understand what an island of prayer was doing, wearing a king's ransom in gold. Northumbria, the great kingdom of northern England, had spent the previous century and a half becoming one of the brightest corners of Europe. Its monasteries were not humble hermitages. They were the universities, libraries, art schools, and treasure houses of their world. At Jarrow, a monk named Bede had written the first great history of the English people, working through some 600 books in his library at a time when a single book cost a herd of cattle. And on Lindisfarne, Holy Island, joined to the coast twice a day by a causeway of wet sand, monks had made one of the most beautiful objects human hands have ever produced. The Lindisfarne Gospels, page after page of interlaced colour, 10,000 decisions of the pen without one visible mistake. St. Cuthbert himself is worth a moment, because his gentleness is the measure of the place. A shepherd boy turned monk turned reluctant bishop. He had ended his life as a hermit on a bare rock further out to sea, praying through the nights while, the stories say, otters warmed his feet, and making one of history's first recorded bird protection rules for the eider ducks that still nest on those islands and are still called Cuddy's ducks, Cuthbert's ducks, today. When his coffin was opened 11 years after his death, the monks found him, so they testified, and so the North believed, perfectly incorrupt, as if asleep. From that moment, Lindisfarne was not merely a monastery. It was the resting place of a living saint and the luckiest, holiest ground in Britain. Lindisfarne was the heart of the North's holiness, and the saint's shrine made it rich. Pilgrims came with gifts, and kings came with grants of land, and the altars gathered a century of silver chalices, golden crosses, jewelled book covers, and embroidered silks, all of it guarded by nothing. Prayer, reputation, the universal understanding of Christian Europe that no one, no matter how violent the age, and it was a violent age, laid hands on the property of God. Daily life there was patient, communal, and quietly industrious. Beyond the church stood the workshops that made the island famous, the scriptorium where the great Gospels had been written, a labour, scholars reckon, of years on vellum that had required the skins of well over 100 calves, the school where boys given to the monastery learned their letters, barns, brewhouse, guest hall for pilgrims. There were no walls worth the name. The community's founders had chosen a tidal island precisely because the sea was their protection. Twice a day, God drew up the drawbridge. The monks kept the hours, from the dark of matins to the candlelight of Compline. The tide came in and went out, and that universal understanding held, right up until the moment it met people who had never subscribed to it. And there had been, for those who later remembered it, one small dress rehearsal that nobody understood at the time. A few years earlier, 3 strange ships had put in on the south coast at Portland. The King's Reeve, a conscientious official named Bygone, rode down to meet them, assuming they were traders who ought to be escorted to the royal manor to pay their dues. He spoke to them in the language of rules and tolls. They killed him on the beach. The chronicler noted it as a puzzling outrage. Only in hindsight did England understand it had met its future. If the monks' world felt secure, the kingdom around them did not. Northumbria's golden age was tarnishing fast. In the very years before the raid, one king had been deposed, another murdered by his own household, a third, Ethelred, restored to a throne he had already lost once, and busy killing potential rivals. Alcuin's furious letters home name it all: perjury, murder among princes, luxury at the top and hunger below. When he came to explain the catastrophe at Lindisfarne, he did not reach far for a cause. A kingdom that ate itself, he warned, should not be surprised when the wolves came to the fold. Modern historians prefer winds and silver to divine judgment. But on the simple point that Northumbria was distracted and divided at exactly the wrong moment, the old scholar was not wrong. There had been omens that year, or so it seemed afterward, when men searched their memories for warning. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records them with a shudder you can still feel through the centuries. Immense whirlwinds and lightning storms over Northumbria, and fiery dragons seen flying in the air. A great famine followed, and then, says the Chronicle, in one of the most quietly devastating sentences in English history, a little after that, in the same year, the harrying of the heathen miserably destroyed God's church in Lindisfarne by rapine and slaughter. It was the 8th of June, early summer, when the North Sea is at its gentlest and a passage from the fjords is fast sailing. That detail matters, and no one on the island knew enough to fear it yet. From now on, for 2.5 centuries, good sailing weather itself would mean danger. The English would learn to pray in words that may echo a real litany of the age. From the fury of the Northmen, good Lord, deliver us. Consider too what the two sides carried that morning. A Norse warband came ashore in mail or leather, with round shields, bearded axes, swords whose making was the finest metallurgy in Northern Europe. Men trained from boyhood in exactly this kind of fighting. Against them, monks. The rule of the community forbade weapons. The strongest thing on the island was a fisherman's boat hook. Every raid in this opening generation had that same terrible arithmetic, and the raiders knew it. That was the point. The plan did not require a battle. It required only a beach and speed. Reconstruct the morning as nearly as the evidence allows. Low water or near it. The raiders knew the tides or read them at a glance, and a beaching is best done on a making tide that will float you off again. The island's day already hours old. Bread baked, the young boys at their letters. Brothers in the fields, the community farmed on the mainland shore. The older monks at work over vellum in the north light. Perhaps the bell going for one of the lesser hours. The bell that called to prayer and that would, in the years ahead become all along these coasts an alarm signal instead. The sea bright to the east, and on it, where there had been nothing, sails. We do not know who saw the sails first. Ships were not strange. Traders came up the coast all summer. What was strange came later and fast. The ships not standing off in the roadstead, but driving straight for the beach. The way no cargo vessel ever behaved, the keels sliding up onto the sand at speed, and men coming over the bows into the shallows, dozens of them, armed, moving with terrible purpose toward the church. What followed was recorded a generation later by the chronicler Simeon of Durham, drawing on the memories of the community. The raiders, he wrote, laid everything waste with grievous plundering. They dug up the altars, dug them up, hunting the relics and treasures beneath. They seized every ornament of the holy church. Some of the brothers they killed outright. Some they carried off in fetters, bound for the slave markets of the north. Some they drove out naked and insulted, and some, he says, they drowned in the sea. There is no way to soften that mourning, and we will not try. Men who had taken vows of peace, who owned nothing, whose days were bread and prayer and copying work, met men for whom a monastery was precisely what it appeared to be. An unguarded warehouse with a bell tower. It was over in hours. The ships went back down the beach on the tide, heavier than they came, and the survivors were left with their dead, their broken altars, and the news which would travel further and hit harder than any raid. What the survivors did next says everything about them. They stayed. Bishop Higbold and the remnant of his community buried their dead, repaired what could be repaired, and took up the hours again, matins in the dark, the psalms in their courses. On the same sand where the keels had grounded, the shrine of Cuthbert was intact. The saint, they told themselves, had protected his own body, if not his boys. Pilgrims kept coming. The island school reopened. It is one of the age's quiet, stubborn heroisms, easy to miss beside the axes. The people who simply carried on the front line for decades. Because the alternative was to concede that the sea belonged to the raiders. Because Lindisfarne was not just any monastery. Striking it was like striking a cathedral, a royal tomb, and a national library at once. Across Europe, wherever the faith reached, men felt the shock of it, felt for the first time in living memory that the sea itself had turned hostile, and that nothing sacred was safe anywhere within sound of the surf. We can measure that shock precisely because one of the most famous men in Europe happened to be a Northumbrian abroad, and he put his grief in writing. Alcuin of York was the greatest scholar of his generation, headhunted years before by Charlemagne himself to run the palace school of the Frankish Empire. When word of Lindisfarne reached him, he wrote home, to the King of Northumbria, to the bishop, to the surviving brothers. Letters that still exist and still tremble. It is nearly 350 years, he wrote, that we and our fathers have inhabited this most lovely land, and never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. Nor was it thought possible, he said, that such an inroad from the sea could be made. There is the whole age in one sentence of a stunned scholar. It was not thought possible. Europe's defences, such as they were, all faced inland. Walls against neighbouring kingdoms. Hosts levied against armies that marched by road and announced themselves. Nobody had built anything against an enemy who arrived out of the empty horizon at rowing speed, struck within the hour, and was gone before any lord could saddle a horse. It is worth knowing who was writing those letters to feel their weight. Alcuin ran what amounted to the intellectual headquarters of Western Europe, Charlemagne's palace school at Aachen, and stood as close to the most powerful man in Christendom as any scholar has ever stood to power. When he wrote that the blood of saints had been poured out around the altar where he himself had prayed as a boy, all of literate Europe read it over his shoulder. The raid on one small island became, through his pen, the whole civilization's news story, the 9th century equivalent of footage on every screen. On the island itself, the survivors gathered around their Bishop Higbald to count what was left. It is to Higbald and his brothers that Alcuin's tenderest letter went, comfort first, scolding after, and in it one line of pure practicality that historians treasure. If the return of the captive boys could be arranged, he wrote, he would gladly help see to it, whether by appeal or by ransom. Somewhere behind that sentence lies the age's grim ordinary machinery. Messengers, brokers, weighed silver, by which at least some of Lindisfarne's stolen children may have come home. We do not know if they did. The letters are all that survive. Alcuin, being a churchman of his age, also reached for the explanation his world required. Such a calamity must be punishment. For luxury, for thin devotion, for fine clothes and foreign fashions. He scolded the survivors even as he comforted them, and begged his king to consider the state of the kingdom's soul. We may read it differently now, but notice what his letters do not do. They do not treat the raiders as the end of the world. He wrote practical letters too, about ransoming the boys carried off, about restoring the community. Europe's first reaction to the Vikings, in other words, was the full human range, horror, theology, and negotiation. So who were they, the men in the shallows? Set aside, for a moment, everything the word Viking carries. They came from the lands we now call Norway, Denmark and Sweden, a world of long coastlines and short summers, of scattered farms on fjord sides and islands, where the sea was not a barrier but the only road there was. They were farmers, fishers, boat builders, traders, societies of free landholders under local chieftains, rich in timber, iron, furs and seamanship, and chronically short of two things, good farmland and silver. And they had, quite recently, perfected the finest seagoing technology on the planet. How they found their way deserves a word, because they did it with nothing we would call an instrument. No compass, no chart, no astrolabe. The tools of our Age of Exploration series were centuries away and a world to the south. A Norse skipper carried the route in his head as a chain of knowledge. So many days sail on this bearing, keeping the pole star at that height above the horizon at night, the sun there at noon. Watch for the sea to change colour where the currents meet. The birds will tell you. A fulmar means open ocean. A gannet means land within flying distance. On a clear day, you will raise the ice blink of the mountains before the mountains themselves. Sailing directions of exactly this kind were still being recited in Iceland centuries later, word for word, like poems. It was navigation as memory, and it took them, in time, to the edge of the known world and past it. A ship's crew, it is worth understanding, was not a military unit, but something warmer and older. A félag, a fellowship, literally a laying together of property. Neighbours and cousins pooled silver to fit out a ship, swore loyalty for the voyage and shared the takings by agreed portions, with lawsuits waiting at home for captains who cheated. 30 or 60 men who had grown up within a day's walk of one another, whose fathers had rowed together under a leader they had chosen and could desert. It made every longship crew fast, flexible and very hard to frighten, an armed village afloat. And it meant the Viking Age was, among everything else, history's most successful joint stock venture before the invention of the joint stock company. The strangest part is how new their mastery was. The sail reached Scandinavia astonishingly late. The northern ships of Roman times were rowed, and only in the century or so before Lindisfarne did the Norse marry the sail to their light, flexible hulls and deep keels. When the marriage happened, it changed what the sea meant. Voyages that had taken weeks of coast-hugging rowing became days of open water sailing, and a people who had always been good boatmen became, within a few generations, the best deep-sea sailors on earth, navigating without chart or compass, by sun and stars, by landmarks and sea marks, by the flight of birds, the colour of water, the feel of swell and wind that a lifetime aboard prints into the body. The longship deserves a moment of quiet admiration, because everything that follows in this series rides on it. Clinker-built, overlapping planks riveted into a shell so light and flexible it worked with the waves instead of fighting them, with a true keel for sailing and a draft so shallow that a warship carrying 60 men could float in 3 feet of water. It could cross an open sea under sail, then come down a river, then be rowed, then be carried. It could land anywhere there was a beach, which meant for the first time in history that the attack could come literally anywhere the sea touched. When archaeologists lifted one of these ships from a burial mound at Gokstad 1,000 years later, shipwrights studied its lines with disbelief. A replica crossed the Atlantic in 1893 and outran the steamers. Nor were they strangers to wealth and its movement. Scandinavia in 793 was already laced into the world's trade, at market towns like Hedeby in Denmark and Kaupang in Norway, and at Birka on its Swedish lake. Furs and amber and walrus ivory moved south and silver moved north, including increasingly rivers of Arab silver coins, minted in Baghdad and Samarkand, flowing up the Russian rivers into Baltic hands. Archaeologists have dug tens of thousands of those dirhams out of Scandinavian soil. The men of the fjords, in other words, knew precisely what silver was, what it bought, and how much of it the soft lands to the south and west kept lying about in undefended houses of prayer. A word, while we are introducing them, about a word. To their victims, they were simply the heathen, the Northmen, the Danes, whatever their actual home, fjord. Viking, in their own tongue, was not a people at all, but an occupation. To go a Viking meant to go raiding over sea, the way one might go fishing or go trading. And many a man did all three in different summers of the same life. Most Norse men and women never went a Viking at all. The age has taken its name, in other words, from a part-time job, which is worth keeping in mind whenever the horned helmet cartoons crowd in. And no, the helmets, for the record, had no horns. Not one has ever been found. Why did they come? Not out of nowhere, and not, whatever the movies say, out of simple bloodlust. The Norse world was already trading down the very coasts it would soon raid. Scandinavian merchants knew exactly where the wealth of Francia and Britain sat, and how lightly it was guarded. At home, chiefdoms were consolidating into kingdoms, and ambitious men needed silver and followers to compete, or needed, having lost, somewhere else to seek their fortunes. Populations were growing against a hard ceiling of arable land, and crucially, there was no shared rulebook with Christian Europe. A monastery's sanctity was internal to Christendom. From seaward, it looked like what it materially was: concentrated, portable, undefended wealth, much of it conveniently marked on the landscape by towers and bells. None of that excuses the drowned brothers of Lindisfarne, but it explains the pattern about to unfold. This was not an invasion at first, it was a business model. To understand the men in the shallows, not to forgive them, but to understand them, you have to know what they believe was watching. The Norse sailed under a crowded sky. Odin, the one-eyed lord of battle and poetry and cunning, who had hung himself on the world tree for wisdom and gave victory as unpredictably as he took it. Thor with his hammer, the farmers' and sailors' friend, whose sign men wore in little amulets, the way the monks wore crosses. Archaeologists find the two, hammer and cross, in the same graves of this in-between age, and sometimes a soapstone mould made to cast both, the smith hedging his customers' bets. Freya, who took half the battle dead, ran with her drowning net under the waves. Land spirits in every headland. A dragon prow, some said, was unshipped when nearing home, so as not to frighten the spirits of one's own shore. And over all of it, deeper than any god, lay fate. The Norns wove every man's thread at birth, and no cunning could add an hour to it. That belief could have bred despair. Instead it bred a terrifying practical courage. If the hour of your death was already fixed, then caution could not save you, and boldness could not doom you, so you might as well be bold. The only thing fate left in a man's own hands was the manner of his going and the name he left behind. Of all the verses the age remembered, the ones that mattered most say roughly this: cattle die, kinsmen die, you yourself will die, but the fame of a good name never dies. For a young man at an oar in 793, heaven was not the point. The story was the point. You can see that faith most clearly in how they buried their great ones. A generation after Lindisfarne, on a fjord in Norway, two women, a queen perhaps, and her companion, were laid in a complete seagoing ship. The magnificent carved vessel we call the Oseberg ship, with sledges and tapestries, buckets and beds, and the whole mound sealed over ship and all, a vessel for the last voyage. Kings went into the ground the same way, or out onto the water in ships set alight. A people who buried their dead in boats were telling us, as plainly as they could, what they believed a ship was: not a tool, a door. What worked once was tried again, immediately and everywhere. The very next year, raiders struck at Bede's own monastery at Jarrow, though this time the Northumbrians fought back and a storm wrecked part of the fleet. Proof, briefly comforting, that the sea wolves were mortal. It did not slow the tide. In 795, they found Iona, the holiest island of the Celtic West, mother house of saints, off the Scottish coast. They came back in 802 and again in 806, when they killed 68 members of the community on the beach still called Martyrs Bay. The survivors eventually carried their treasures, perhaps including the great gospel book we know as the Book of Kells, inland to safety in Ireland. The islands of prayer which had been placed at the world's edge for holy solitude. discovered that they had been placed precisely on the new front line. Ireland's experience compressed the whole coming century into a preview. Rich in monasteries and poor in central kings, the island was raided almost annually within a decade of Lindisfarne. The Great School of Armagh struck 3 times in a single month, by one account. In time, the raiders' camps at the river mouths hardened into walled trading towns. One of them, at a black tidal pool the Irish called Dublin, grew into Dublin, a Viking town before it was ever an Irish city, and for 2 centuries one of the busiest slave markets of the Western world. The English Church, for its part, began quietly rearranging itself for a new world. Alcuin's letters after 793 carry practical undertones beneath the theology. Treasures were better kept inland. Communities on exposed coasts should think about where they might go. Relics, the spiritual capital of the age, began their long migrations away from the sea. Over the following decades, monastery after monastery on the exposed coasts was abandoned or moved, the manuscripts and saints' bones travelling by cart into the interior. The map of English holiness, drawn for 3 centuries by hermits seeking the wild edges of the world, was redrawn in a single generation by the simple new rule of survival. Pray out of sight of salt water. Ireland's rich monastic world became a hunting ground. The coasts of Francia likewise. The pattern was the same on every coast, with local variations. Frisia's great trading town of Domesday, the Rotterdam of its day, a mile of wharves on a Rhine channel, was sacked in 834, and then again the next year, and the next and the next, 4 years running, until the town that had handled half the North Sea's trade began to die, and its trade, in one of history's small ironies, drifted to safer harbours, including the North's own new markets. And when, in 844, a fleet grew bold enough to round Iberia and take Seville itself, the Emirate of Cordoba answered with something the raiders had not yet met in the West. A state with a professional army and a navy. The Moors retook the city, burned 30 ships, and, the chronicles say, hanged captured raiders from Seville's palm trees. The North took the lesson. For a century afterward, Al-Andalus was mostly left alone. The fury of the Northmen was a business, and businesses avoid unprofitable markets. There is a story, told later, perhaps polished in the telling, that Charlemagne himself, near the end of his life, watched Norse ships reconnoitre a southern harbour and wept at his window, not for any harm they could do him, he said, but because he foresaw what they would do to his descendants. Legend or not, the old emperor's tears were good forecasting. Within a generation of his death, Viking fleets were wintering at the mouths of the Seine and the Loire, and his grandsons were paying them rivers of silver to go away, which is, of course, the one payment that guarantees a return visit. The scale of what protection cost grew almost comically grim. In 845, a fleet of 120 ships, under a leader the sources call Ragnar, around whom the later Ragnar Lothbrok legends would gather like barnacles, rowed up the Seine to Paris itself, took the city at Easter, and departed only when the king of the Franks weighed out 7,000 pounds of silver, the first of the great state ransoms and the proof of concept for a century of them. 30 more such payments would follow on the Seine alone. The silver of Francia flowed north in cartloads, and much of it is still coming out of Scandinavian fields on the blades of ploughs. And here the story must keep its honesty about what the trade was. Silver and church plate were only part of the cargo. The other part was people. Captives from these raids, men, women, children, the boys of Lindisfarne among the first, were carried off into the largest slave network of early medieval Europe, sold through Norse market towns like Dublin and Hedeby. Some passed east along the river roads as far as the markets of the Islamic world. The Viking Age ran on many things: timber, wind, courage, iron. It also ran on this, and no honest telling of it looks away. The Franks, wealthier and better organised, eventually found the raiders' one weakness: rivers have banks. King Charles the Bald ordered fortified bridges thrown across the Seine and its sisters, low, garrisoned deliberately in the way. And the great raids upstream grew slower and costlier. The English, with shallower purses, more often bought time instead. The payments history remembers as Danegeld, weighed out in silver by the £1,000. Both responses worked, after a fashion. Both also taught the North the same profitable lesson. Whether by plunder or by protection money, the ships paid for themselves. It is worth remembering too what the silver became when it got home, because that is where the raiding age's engine really lay. A share from one good summer could set a young man up for life. A farm of his own, a bride price, oathmen standing in the assembly. Arm rings of hacked foreign silver were the age's resume, worn where everyone could count them. For every grizzled sea king in the sagas, there were 100 younger sons who went west precisely once, came home with enough, and spent the rest of their lives farming and retelling it. The monasteries of Europe were burning in the end to pay for barley fields in Norway. The defenders adapted as best they could. Coastal watches were set. Kings like Offa of Mercia ordered defences raised against pagan seamen even before Lindisfarne burned. The danger had been building on the horizon for those with eyes to see, but the raiders' advantages were structural. Choice of time, choice of place, and speed no land power could match. For 50 years, the pattern held, sharper every summer, deeper up every river. Then, in the middle of the 9th century, the pattern changed. Fleets grew from 3 ships to 30 to 300. Raiders began to stay through the winter, camped on coastal islands, eating the countryside. Wives and smiths and merchants started arriving with the war bands. The men from the fjords were no longer visiting, they were moving in. But that is next week's story. And Lindisfarne, here is the gentle ending the island itself earned. The community survived, battered, bereaved, but not destroyed, and not, in the end, driven from history. Monks returned. The shrine of Cuthbert endured on the island for another century, until the age's later storms sent the brothers on their long, famous wandering with the saint's coffin on their shoulders. 7 years on the roads of the north, ending at last at Durham, where Cuthbert lies to this day beneath the greatest Norman cathedral in the world. The Lindisfarne Gospels travelled with them and survive every page in the British Library, as radiant as the morning they were finished. On the island now there are quiet ruins, seabirds, and a small carved stone the archaeologists call the Domesday stone. On one side, figures kneeling in prayer beneath the sun and moon, and on the other, a line of 7 warriors, swords and axes raised, marching forever left to right, carved, most likely, by someone for whom that morning was not history. is as close as we will ever come to a photograph of the 8th of June 793. Hold both sides of that stone in mind as we set out into this series. The Viking Age was the axis, truly, and we will not pretend otherwise. But it was also, as we will see, ships and settlements, poems and law codes, trade routes that stitch 4 continents, and farmers looking for land at the edge of the maps. The men in the shallows at Lindisfarne have descendants in this story, and some of them, before we are done, will be discovering America. Next time, the raids become a conquest. An army the English chronicles called the Great Heathen Army comes to stay, and one young king hiding in a marsh with his kingdom burning refuses to accept the ending everyone else could see: Alfred and the fight for England. That is where we will leave it tonight. Sleep well wherever you are, and when you're ready, we'll go wandering again.